The birthday he never wanted. Keanu Reeves had never been comfortable with birthdays, not because he feared getting older, but because attention had always felt heavier to him than time itself. On that quiet Lowe's Angels morning, sunlight slipped gently through the wide windows of his modest home, touching the wooden floor like a soft reminder that another year had arrived whether he acknowledged it or not. There were no balloons, no assistants rushing in with schedules, no loud celebrations planned, just silence, coffee slowly cooling in his hands, and the familiar weight of reflection settling in his chest. Birthdays for Keanu were not milestones to celebrate, but pauses that forced him to look back at the people he had lost, the roads he had walked alone, and the quiet promises he had made to himself to remain kind in a world that often rewarded the opposite. He had turned his phone face down on the table, not out of arrogance, but because he knew it would light up endlessly with messages he didn't know how to respond to. Gratitude came easily to him, but ceremony never had. Instead, he sat outside on the small porch, listening to the distant hum of traffic, thinking about how strange life was, how quickly it passed, and how often the most meaningful moments arrived unannounced. He had planned nothing for the day, no dinners, no interviews, no appearances, just a long motorcycle ride later in the evening and perhaps a quiet meal somewhere anonymous, the way he preferred. What Keanu didn't know was that somewhere across the city, Sandra Bullock was holding a small, carefully wrapped box in her hands, staring at it longer than she had stared at any script in years. She hadn't planned this for publicity, nor had she told a single person what she intended to do. In fact, she had debated with herself for days, questioning whether it was even appropriate, whether it would cross a line, whether it would reopen something best left gently resting in the past. But birthdays, she believed, were not about spectacle. They were about acknowledgement, about reminding someone that their existence had mattered quietly and consistently in the lives of others, even when they never asked for credit. Sandra had always understood Keanu in a way few people did. Their history was not loud, not scandalous, not built on drama or headlines, but on shared silences, mutual respect, and a deep understanding of loss, endurance, and grace. Over the years, life had taken them in different directions, but the connection had never fully disappeared. It had simply softened, matured, becoming something less fragile and more honest. When she heard through a mutual friend that Keanu planned to spend his birthday alone, something inside her refused to let the day pass unnoticed. The drive to his home was quiet, her thoughts louder than the road. She remembered moments from years ago, late-night conversations between takes, laughter that came unexpectedly, and the rare comfort of being fully seen without having to explain herself. This wasn't nostalgia pulling her forward, it was gratitude. She knew what the world saw when it looked at Keanu Reeves, but she also knew what it often missed, the quiet sacrifices, the empathy he extended to strangers, the way he carried pain without allowing it to harden him. She believed that someone like that deserved more than silence on a day meant to mark his presence in the world. When Sandra arrived, there were no cameras waiting, no press alerts, no dramatic entrance. She parked a short distance away, holding the small box against her chest as if it carried something fragile, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. She walked up to the door slowly, giving herself time to breathe, to steady the emotions she hadn't expected to surface so strongly. When she knocked, she half expected him not to answer, half hoping he would. Keanu opened the door wearing a simple shirt, surprise flickering briefly across his face before warmth replaced it entirely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The silence was familiar, comfortable, filled with years of unspoken understanding. He smiled, that quiet, genuine smile that never seemed rehearsed, and stepped aside without asking why she was there, as if some part of him already knew. Inside, the house felt exactly like him, unpretentious, lived-in calm. Sandra glanced around, noticing the small details, the books stacked casually, the absence of anything that screamed fame. She held out the box gently, her voice soft but steady as she said she didn't come to celebrate in the way the world usually did, but to honor him in the way she knew he would understand. Keanu looked at the gift with curiosity rather than expectation, carefully opening it as though it might disappear if handled too roughly. Inside was not something expensive, not something flashy, but something deeply personal. It was a handwritten letter, accompanied by a small photograph from years ago, one neither of them remembered being taken. The letter spoke of moments that had never been public, kindnesses that had never been documented, conversations that had changed her life without him realizing it. As he read, Keanu felt his chest tighten, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that his quiet way of existing had left a mark deeper than he had ever known. He didn't speak immediately after finishing the letter. He simply sat down, holding it carefully, eyes distant, as if he were seeing pieces of his life from an entirely new angle. Sandra watched him, not intruding, not rushing the moment, understanding that this was never about words. When he finally looked up, there was a softness in his eyes that mirrored her own, and in that shared glance, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that sometimes the most powerful gifts are not objects, but reminders. Neither of them knew that what had just occurred in that quiet living room would ripple outward far beyond that single day. What began as a private act of respect and gratitude was about to remind countless people that kindness does not need an audience, that love does not always demand labels, and that the most emotional moments often happen when no one is watching. And as Keanu gently folded the letter and placed it beside him, he had no idea that this birthday, the one he never wanted to acknowledge, would become one of the most meaningful turning points of his life. The quiet weight of what was never said. The silence that followed Sandra's gift did not feel awkward or unfinished. It felt complete in a way that only rare moments ever do, like a deep breath finally released after being held for years. Keanu remained seated, the letter resting lightly in his hands, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the room, as though the words she had written had opened doors inside him he rarely allowed himself to approach. He had lived most of his life believing that the truest acts of kindness vanished the moment they were given, never expecting them to return, never imagining they might linger in someone else's heart long enough to be remembered, let alone written down. Yet here it was, proof that even the smallest gestures, the quiet conversations, the uncelebrated moments of empathy, had not dissolved into nothing, but had instead taken root, grown quietly, and found their way back to him on a day he had tried so hard to keep ordinary. Sandra watched him carefully, not with concern, but with respect, sensing that he was standing at the edge of an emotional place he rarely visited. She had not come to reopen old chapters or to rewrite history, but she knew that truth had a way of surfacing when it was finally ready, and sometimes it arrived wearing the face of a memory you never realized you were still carrying. She spoke softly, not to interrupt his thoughts, but to ground the moment, telling him that she had written the letter slowly over many nights because she wanted it to be honest, not polished, not perfect, just real. She told him that there were moments in her life when the world felt loud and unforgiving, and it was his quiet steadiness, his ability to listen without trying to fix, that had taught her strength could exist without armor. Keanu finally looked at her, his voice calm but heavier than before, and admitted something he had never said out loud, that he often wondered whether kindness mattered in a world that seemed to move faster every year, that rewarded noise and spectacle more than patience and humility. He confessed that there were days he questioned whether being gentle was a liability, whether choosing empathy over ambition had cost him things he would never get back. Saying it out loud felt strange, like admitting doubt in a philosophy he had lived by instinctively rather than intentionally. Sandra didn't rush to reassure him, didn't counter his words with optimism or platitudes. Instead, she nodded, acknowledging the weight of the question itself, and told him that she had asked herself the same thing countless times, especially in an industry that often mistook vulnerability for weakness. They sat together for a long time after that, not revisiting the past in detail, but allowing it to exist between them without fear or regret. Outside, the afternoon light shifted slowly, shadows stretching across the room, marking time in a way that felt almost symbolic. Keanu poured another cup of coffee, the simple routine grounding him, and offered one to Sandra without asking, just as he always had, an unspoken habit formed long before words were necessary. She accepted it with a small smile, realizing that some connections did not require maintenance to survive. They simply endured. As the conversation drifted gently forward, Sandra shared why she had chosen to come in person rather than send the gift through someone else. She said that birthdays were strange things, moments when people expected joy, but often carried reflection instead, and she had sensed, without being told, that this one might be heavier for him than most. She admitted that she had hesitated, worried she might intrude on a space he guarded carefully, but something inside her had insisted that presence mattered more than distance that day. Keanu listened, his expression thoughtful, and then surprised her by thanking her not just for the letter, but for understanding when to arrive quietly, without expectation, without needing anything in return. What neither of them realized yet was that the ripple of that visit was already spreading beyond the walls of the house. A neighbor, unaware of who she was, noticed Sandra arrive and leave, later mentioning casually to a friend that Keanu had company on his birthday, someone who stayed long enough to matter. The comment was harmless, insignificant on its own. But in a city where whispers traveled faster than truth, it began a chain of curiosity neither of them had intended to spark. Still inside that home, the world remained distant, muted, irrelevant. As evening approached, Keanu suggested they step outside for a short walk, not to be seen, but to breathe, to let the day settle into something real. They walked without destination, the conversation thinning naturally, replaced by shared awareness of the city around them, the ordinary lives unfolding unnoticed. At one point, Sandra paused, looking at him with an expression that carried both gratitude and restraint, and told him that she hoped he would keep the letter somewhere safe, not as a reminder of the past, but as evidence that the way he chose to live had mattered more than he ever knew. He nodded, folding it carefully again, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, closer to his heart than he realized. When they eventually parted, there were no promises made, no plans set, no dramatic farewells. Sandra left the same way she had arrived, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention. Keanu watched her go, feeling something unfamiliar yet peaceful settle within him, not longing, not regret, but a renewed sense of clarity. For the first time in years, his birthday no longer felt like something to endure or ignore. It felt like a marker, not of age, but of connection, of meaning carried forward through kindness rather than erased by time. And as night fell over the city, Keanu stood alone once more. But differently than before, the weight of the day transformed into something lighter, steadier. He had no way of knowing that the next part of this story would not remain private for long, that the world, drawn instinctively to sincerity, would soon notice the shift, and that a simple birthday visit would become the quiet beginning of a moment that would move far beyond the two people who never meant for it to be seen at all. When quiet moments begin to echo, the days that followed Keanu's birthday unfolded with a subtle shift in the air, the kind that could not be measured or explained, only felt, as though something gentle yet irreversible had been set in motion. Keanu returned to his routine with the same calm discipline he had always carried, riding through the city on his motorcycle, keeping his head down, engaging with the world at a pace that felt honest to him. Yet inside, something had changed. The letter Sandra had written stayed with him, not as a relic of memory, but as a living reminder that the life he had chosen, the quiet path of kindness, restraint, and humility, had not disappeared into the void the way he once believed. It had echoed back, shaped another human being, and returned to him with meaning. He kept the letter folded carefully in the pocket of his jacket, not reading it again obsessively, but knowing it was there like an anchor. There were moments, waiting at traffic lights or sitting alone with a simple meal, when fragments of Sandra's words resurfaced in his thoughts, not with nostalgia but with clarity. He realized that much of his discomfort with birthdays had come from an unspoken fear that his existence was more symbolic than personal, that people admired an image rather than the man beneath it. That fear softened now, replaced by the understanding that even unseen lives could be touched deeply, that sincerity did not need to be witnessed to be real. Sandra, meanwhile, returned to her own life with the same discretion she had brought to his doorstep. She did not speak of the visit in interviews, did not hint at it on social media, did not allow herself to revisit it publicly even in her thoughts. Yet she felt lighter, steadier, as though a long-delayed truth had finally been delivered where it belonged. She had not gone to rekindle something old, nor to close a chapter, but to honor a presence that had mattered to her more than she had ever fully expressed. In doing so, she had given herself permission to acknowledge the depth of connection without fear of misunderstanding it. What neither of them could control, however, was the way the world sensed authenticity like a shift in gravity. It began quietly, with a few online discussions noting that Keanu seemed different lately, not in any visible way, but in energy, in expression, in the softness of his rare public appearances. Fans who had followed him for years remarked that he looked more at peace than usual, that something in his demeanor suggested not change, but affirmation. Speculation followed, as it always did, but it lacked its usual sharpness, replaced instead by curiosity tinged with respect. People were not asking what he was hiding, they were wondering what had helped him feel whole. Then, without warning, a small moment broke the surface. During a casual outing, someone captured a brief image of Keanu standing outside a modest cafe, jacket open, the corner of the folded letter just barely visible from his pocket. The photograph itself meant nothing to the person who took it, but to those who saw it later, it became a symbol. Commentators speculated not about romance or scandal, but about what could possibly matter enough to him to be carried so close, so carefully. The conversation online shifted unexpectedly, moving away from gossip and toward something rarer, reflection. Keanu noticed the shift too, not because he was watching the internet, but because strangers began speaking to him differently. A barista thanked him not for his films, but for the way he carried himself. A man at a gas station told him quietly that seeing someone remain gentle in a harsh world gave him hope. These encounters unsettled him more than praise ever had, because they reflected back a version of himself he had never intentionally tried to present, only lived. He began to understand that authenticity, once recognized, had a way of multiplying itself. Sandra felt the echo from a distance. Friends mentioned in passing that Keanu seemed to be inspiring people again, not through performance but through presence. She said nothing, smiled quietly, and let the moment belong to what it was becoming. She understood that some connections did not need to be defined publicly to be powerful. They needed only to exist truthfully. Yet there were nights when she thought about that afternoon in his home, the stillness of it, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them, and she wondered whether the world's attention might someday test what had been given so freely and privately. That test arrived sooner than either of them expected. An interviewer, during what was meant to be a routine promotional conversation, asked Keanu a simple question about his birthday, expecting a polite deflection. Instead, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically but sincerely. He did not mention Sandra by name, did not reveal details, did not turn the moment into a headline. He simply said that the best gift he had received that year was a reminder that kindness leaves traces long after the moment has passed. The studio went quiet. The interviewer paused, sensing the gravity beneath the simplicity, and moved on without pressing further. That short exchange traveled farther than any rumor ever could. It resonated with people who felt unseen, unheard, uncertain whether their quiet goodness mattered in a world obsessed with noise. Messages poured in, not demanding explanations, but offering gratitude, sharing stories of small acts that had once changed everything. Keanu read some of them late at night, sitting alone, realizing that what had started as a personal birthday gesture had opened a door he could not close even if he wanted to. Nor did he wish to. Sandra saw the interview later alone and felt a warmth settle in her chest. She recognized the restraint in his words, the care he had taken not to expose what had been sacred. It affirmed what she had always known about him, that he protected meaning not by hiding it, but by honoring it. She understood then that whatever came next would not be about them as individuals, but about the message that had been quietly released into the world. And as the days continued to unfold, both of them sensed that the story was no longer confined to a single birthday, a single letter, or a single visit. It was becoming something larger, something that would soon demand a choice, not between privacy and exposure, but between silence and purpose. The quiet moment had echoed, and the world was listening not for drama, but for truth. When the world knocks on a private door, the attention that followed did not arrive loudly, nor did it demand entry the way spectacle usually does. Instead, it hovered at the edges of their lives like a persistent question waiting to be answered. Keanu felt it most in the quiet moments, when solitude, once effortless, began to require intention. Invitations increased, interview requests shifted in tone, and conversations that once stayed comfortably shallow now carried an undercurrent of expectation, as if the world sensed there was a story forming and hoped he might complete it for them. He did not resent this curiosity, but he was wary of it, knowing how easily meaning could be diluted once it was pulled too far into the light. He returned to work, finding comfort in structure, in the rhythm of preparation and presence that acting had always offered him. On set, crew members treated him as they always had, with warmth and respect, yet there was a new softness in their eyes, a recognition that went beyond professional admiration. People spoke to him not as a symbol, but as someone who had reminded them of something they had forgotten, and that realization carried its own responsibility. Keanu listened more than he spoke, absorbing the stories people shared, understanding that whatever had begun on his birthday had tapped into something larger than himself. Sandra experienced the echo differently. Her life had long been lived under observation, but this felt distinct, less invasive and more contemplative. Interviewers asked broader questions about empathy, about how artists carried their humanity into their work, about whether quiet strength still had a place in modern storytelling. She answered thoughtfully, carefully, never pointing the spotlight toward a single moment or person, but gently reinforcing the idea that sincerity did not require performance. She understood that restraint was not avoidance, it was stewardship. The true test arrived unexpectedly, in the form of an invitation neither of them had anticipated. A respected humanitarian organization reached out to Keanu, inviting him to attend a small, private gathering honoring individuals who had quietly influenced social good without seeking recognition. There would be no press, no announcements, no cameras allowed inside. The invitation was not framed as an award, but as a conversation, a chance to sit among people who believed that impact was measured not by reach, but by depth. Keanu hesitated. He had avoided formal honors for most of his life, uncomfortable with the implication that goodness could be ranked or displayed. Yet something about the nature of this gathering felt aligned with what had been unfolding, less about celebration and more about acknowledgement. He accepted quietly, without telling anyone beyond a close circle, and arrived on the evening of the event without entourage or expectation. The room was modest, filled with people from vastly different walks of life, teachers, volunteers, caregivers, artists, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. No one asked him about films or fame. Instead, they asked about listening, about staying present in the face of loss, about how one chose kindness when bitterness might have been easier. Keanu spoke honestly, not offering answers but sharing uncertainty, admitting that he often did not know whether what he did mattered, only that it felt necessary. Sandra was not there, but she felt the moment from afar, sensing in the subtle ways that something important was taking shape. When Keanu later reached out, not to recount the evening, but to thank her again for reminding him that quiet truths deserved space, she understood that the ripple had found a new current. Their communication remained sparse, deliberate, free from expectation, yet every exchange carried depth, like letters written between lines. Outside that circle, the world continued to search for definition. Headlines speculated gently, some respectful, some misguided, attempting to frame the shift they sensed in terms they could understand. Keanu did not correct them, nor did Sandra. They both recognized that the story did not belong to public interpretation. It belonged to the lives it touched quietly, invisibly. Still, the pressure to speak more openly grew, not from tabloids, but from people who saw in their restraint a model worth naming. The moment of decision came not through demand, but through empathy. Keanu received a letter handwritten from a stranger who described how a small act of kindness years earlier had prevented a personal collapse. The letter did not mention films or fame. It mentioned presence, patience, and the courage to remain gentle. Keanu read it slowly, recognizing the familiar shape of the words, the way sincerity revealed itself without ornament. He understood then that silence, while protective, could also be an opportunity missed if it withheld reassurance from those who needed it. Sandra faced a similar realization when a young artist approached her after an event, thanking her for speaking about vulnerability as strength. The artist said that hearing someone respected speak openly about restraint and empathy had given them permission to remain themselves in an industry that often demanded performance over truth. Sandra listened, her chest tightening with the understanding that what she and Keanu had shared privately was now informing choices beyond their control, and perhaps beyond their ownership. Neither of them believed in grand declarations, nor did they feel compelled to turn a personal moment into a public message. Yet they began to consider how to honor what had begun without betraying its essence. Conversations deepened, not frequent, but purposeful, circling around the same question from different angles. How to offer light without blinding, how to share meaning without commodifying it. As the weeks passed, a quiet resolve formed between them, unspoken yet understood. They would not explain the moment, nor define it for the world. Instead, they would allow it to guide their actions forward, choosing presence over publicity, consistency over commentary. The world might continue to speculate, but the truth would remain intact, carried not in headlines, but in behavior. And so, what had started as a birthday gift became something enduring, not a story to be told, but a standard to be lived. The private door the world had knocked upon would remain mostly closed, but the warmth from within would continue to seep out, touching those who passed by, reminding them that the most powerful transformations often happen without announcement, shaped quietly by choice rather than spectacle. What endures when the noise fades? Time has a way of testing the sincerity of any moment, not by how loudly it is remembered, but by how faithfully it reshapes the days that follow. As the weeks turned into months, the attention that once hovered at the edges of Keanu's life began to thin, drifting toward newer stories, louder controversies, brighter distractions. This was the natural order of things, and he welcomed it without relief or disappointment, only acceptance. What remained after the noise softened was something far more demanding than curiosity: consistency. It required him to live the meaning of that birthday every ordinary day, when no one was watching, when kindness was no longer symbolic but simply necessary. He found himself more attentive to the spaces between moments, to conversations that asked nothing of him except presence. On set, he continued to arrive early, to help quietly where help was needed, not because it reinforced a narrative, but because it felt aligned with the version of himself he was choosing again and again. Crew members noticed not a change, but a steadiness, as if the man they had always respected had settled more fully into himself. There were fewer words exchanged about it, yet a deeper trust grew, one built on the understanding that sincerity does not fluctuate with attention. Sandra, too, felt the quiet settling of things. She returned fully to her work, to the discipline and joy of storytelling, yet something in her approach had softened without losing strength. She chose roles more carefully, not for acclaim, but for resonance, stories that allowed humanity to breathe rather than perform. When she spoke about her craft, she spoke less about success and more about responsibility, about how stories could remind people of who they were before the world taught them to be guarded. Those who listened closely sensed that these words were lived, not rehearsed. Their connection continued, understated and intentional. They exchanged messages occasionally, not to maintain closeness, but to acknowledge moments of understanding, a line from a book, a quiet observation, a shared recognition of something human and fleeting. There was no urgency in these exchanges, no expectation that they should become more or less than they were. In that freedom, the connection found its strength, unburdened by definition. One evening, months after the birthday, Keanu attended a small community event without announcement or accompaniment. It was held in a modest hall, dedicated to honoring volunteers who worked with displaced families, people whose lives were shaped by loss yet sustained by resilience. He sat among them, listening to stories that carried weight far beyond his own. When he was asked unexpectedly to say a few words, he hesitated not from fear but from care. He spoke briefly, not about inspiration, but about attention, about the simple act of noticing one another, of choosing patience when haste was easier. The room did not erupt in applause. It settled into something quieter, more meaningful. Sandra learned of the event days later through a mutual friend who mentioned it casually, without emphasis. She smiled when she heard, recognizing the familiar shape of his choices. It reaffirmed what she had always known, that whatever impact he had would come not from intention to lead, but from willingness to remain open. She realized then that the gift she had given on his birthday had not created something new. It had merely reflected back to him what had already been true, allowing him to see it more clearly. As seasons changed, both of them noticed something subtle yet profound in the way people around them responded. There was less hunger for explanation, more respect for boundaries, as if the world, briefly reminded of the power of restraint, had softened its grip. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to matter. They understood that this was not a permanent shift, but a temporary opening, one that required care rather than celebration. Keanu returned one evening to the place where he had spent his birthday alone before Sandra arrived, standing on the porch as the light faded, remembering how he had once wished the day would pass unnoticed. He smiled at the thought, not with irony, but with gratitude. He understood now that moments did not need to be planned to be transformative. They needed only to be met honestly. He reached into his jacket, feeling the familiar fold of the letter still there, worn softer by time, and felt no urge to read it again. Its work had already been done. Sandra, miles away, found herself writing late into the night, not a letter this time, but notes for a project she hoped would never become a headline. It was about ordinary people, quiet courage, the strength of showing up without recognition. As she wrote, she realized that the story she wanted to tell had already been lived, not once, but many times, by people who would never be named. That realization grounded her, reminding her why she had chosen this life in the first place. What endured between them was not a moment frozen in memory, but a shared commitment to let meaning outlive attention. They did not speak of the birthday anymore, not because it had lost importance, but because it had transformed into something ongoing, a lens through which they viewed the world and their place within it. And in that continuity, they found something rare and sustaining. The quiet confidence that kindness, once given freely, continues to move forward, shaping lives long after the moment itself has passed, asking for nothing in return except the courage to keep choosing it. The meaning that remains. Years later, when people spoke about that season of their lives, they rarely remembered dates or headlines, because what endured did not belong to a calendar. It lived instead in choices made quietly, in pauses taken before reacting, in the courage to remain gentle when hardness would have been easier to justify. Keanu had come to understand that life did not ask him to explain himself, only to continue showing up with integrity when the moment required it. The letter Sandra had given him had long since been placed somewhere safe, no longer carried in his jacket, not because it mattered less, but because its message had fully settled into his way of being. It had become less a reminder and more a foundation. He spent more time traveling anonymously, finding comfort in places where no one recognized him, where he could observe the world as it was rather than as it expected him to be. In those spaces, he listened to people who would never know his name, hearing their stories without the distortion of fame. He noticed how often they spoke about being unseen, about small kindnesses that had kept them moving forward when everything else seemed uncertain. Each time he felt a quiet confirmation that the path he had chosen, long before his birthday, long before Sandra's visit, had been the right one all along. Sandra's life continued with its own rhythm, shaped by work that felt increasingly purposeful. She became more selective not just with roles, but with the way she gave her energy, choosing depth over exposure, honesty over performance. In interviews, she spoke about resilience not as triumph, but as endurance, the slow, patient work of remaining open without losing oneself. People listened differently now, not because she was louder, but because her words carried weight earned through consistency rather than spectacle. She rarely spoke of Keanu, and when she did, it was never as a symbol, but as a reminder that shared humanity did not need to be named to be felt. They crossed paths occasionally, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by chance, each meeting marked by the same quiet understanding that had defined their connection from the beginning. There were no long discussions about the past, no need to revisit what had already found its place. Instead, there were simple acknowledgments, a look that carried recognition, a conversation that moved easily between silence and meaning. In those moments, they understood that some relationships existed not to evolve, but to stabilize, to remind each person of who they were when stripped of expectation. The world inevitably moved on. New stories replaced old ones, louder voices demanded attention, and the brief collective reflection that had once formed around Keanu's birthday faded into memory. Yet something subtle remained beneath the surface, a residue of that moment carried forward by people who had taken it to heart. Kindness did not trend, but it persisted, passed quietly from one person to another, uncredited and unrecorded. That, Keanu realized, was its strength. On one quiet evening, long after the significance of that birthday had blurred into the texture of everyday life, Keanu found himself watching the city lights from a distance, thinking not about what had happened, but about what had continued. He felt no need to define it, no urge to capture it in words. He understood that meaning did not require permanence to be real. It required presence. And presence, once chosen, had a way of repeating itself naturally. Sandra, elsewhere, experienced a similar clarity. She realized that the most impactful moments of her life were not the ones applauded or archived, but the ones that quietly changed how she moved through the world. The birthday visit had not been an act of closure or confession. It had been an alignment, a recognition of shared values that transcended time and circumstance. Knowing that was enough. In the end, there was no grand conclusion, no defining statement, no final scene that wrapped everything neatly into meaning. There was only continuation, the steady unfolding of lives shaped by small, deliberate choices. What happened next did not leave everyone emotional because it was dramatic or unexpected, but because it was human. It reminded those who witnessed it, directly or indirectly, that sincerity did not need permission, that kindness did not expire, and that the quietest gestures often carried the longest echoes. And so the story did not end where it began, on a birthday marked by silence, but extended outward into countless ordinary days where compassion was chosen without ceremony. That was what remained when everything else faded, not a moment remembered, but a way of living that continued quietly, faithfully, long after the world stopped watching.